welcome everyone to another episode of Cyber Talk with Nikolai. Today we have a very exciting topic, cyber threats and geopolitics. And we also have a very exciting host with us, our guest, Dmitry Alpertovich. And some of you probably know him from his past experience working with CrowdStrike, but he also executive chairman at Accelerator. He's author, podcast, co-founded CrowdStrike, also board member for various organizations. And he also has interesting and popular Geopolitics Decanted podcast. I would encourage you to listen to it. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dmitry and have him say a little bit about himself and some interesting things before we dive into our topic. Dmitry?
Thanks so much, Nikolai. It's great to be back with you. And yes, I've spent a lot of my career in cybersecurity, really at the intersection of cybersecurity and national security. Co-founded CrowdStrike, where a lot of our focus, particularly in the early days, was nation-state threat actors, threat from China in cyberspace, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so forth. And for the last 4 years, I've been focused on exclusively the national security matters. I co-founded a think tank called Silverado Policy Accelerator, which really looks at the great power competition, particularly with China, and looks really at all the dimensions of that conflict, both cyber dimension, military, diplomatic, economic, technological. And based on that work over the last 4 years, I spent the last 2 years writing a book, which comes out on April 30th, called World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. That is really the grand strategy of how do we defeat China and what does even victory mean. I passionately believe that we are in a new Cold War with China, but it's a little bit different from the first Cold War, and it requires, yet again, for us to think strategically about how do we actually win.
Great. Thank you, Dimitri. Yeah, certainly you have exciting career. So one question come to mind, and this is from past experience knowing you and having interaction. And then when you ended up switching from cybersecurity into policy accelerator, and I was thinking to myself, how the heck did you end up in geopolitics? So what happened then? You had very successful career in cybersecurity, and then boom, all of a sudden you founded Silverado Accelerator, left CrowdStrike, and so what was the driving force for you to? Because both fields are seems to be quite interesting and challenging, and hearing you say that they're both exciting, being in cyber and then being in geopolitics, but you decided to somewhat leave cyber and ended up in geopolitics.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've actually, believe it or not, have always been passionate about this issue in college while taking a lot of cyber courses and graduating with a degree in cybersecurity from Georgia Tech, actually being the first graduate with a master's degree in that field that they established back in those days. I was also taking tons of international affairs courses, nuclear nonproliferation, counterterrorism, and the like, and was always very, very passionate about this, but thought that once I leave college, I'll never get to use any of that knowledge, any of those passions again, and really got pulled back into geopolitics because of cyber, because in 2010, and as I was investigating what I later called Operation Aurora, the hack of Google, and many other companies back in 2009, 2010 timeframe, I got pulled straight into national security circles, had meetings with the State Department, later White House, in the Situation Room, talking about the implications of cyber to our national security, implications of the massive scale of Chinese intellectual property theft against our company that was taking place. Later on, it was Russia and Iran and North Korea. I was the first one to have come out and publicly attributed Sony hack to North Korea, for example, back in those days. So I've just had really a privilege of witnessing and having a front row seat to a lot of really impactful cybersecurity incidents that had an impact on national security and been involved in a lot of those discussions at really high levels within U.S. government. I've been advisor to the Department of Defense on a range of issues. So this has always been something that I've focused on and always had a deep interest in. But when I was at CrowdStrike, I was preoccupied with making that company successful, which was a full-time job and then some. So after we took the company public in 2019, and I had an opportunity to sort of think longer term about what I want to do next in my life, I ultimately ended up retiring from the company in 2010 and going full time into this field.
That sounds exciting. Thank you, Dimitri, for that. So let's talk about our favorite one. One of the favorite talk. Let's talk about bears. Cozy bear, fancy bear, angry bear. I don't think I've seen angry bear, but there are many other bears you guys put together and as a threat
They're getting
actors.
very angry these days, indeed.
Yeah. So making relevance between all those bears and obviously they're all Russian sponsored state actors and geopolitics. We had exposure on Office of Personnel Management that CrowdStrike was involved in, and I think you were deeply involved in that investigation as well, trying to defend and get the information and who was behind the attack. So how did this bears and how this whole geopolitics, what is going on in Russia and everything else, give birth to all those various threat actors?
Yeah, OPM was actually pandas, not bears, a different type of bear, I guess, but that was China. But the Russians obviously have been very active in this field, going back to the 1980s. In fact, one of the things I did at CrowdStrike for one of our conferences, annual conferences, I had Cliff Stoll come and give a keynote speech, famously the author of Kukozag, really one of the founders, I think, of the cybersecurity field. This man literally invented forensics. He invented attribution. He invented in cyberspace. He invented honeypots and a whole slew of things that he had to come up with as he was investigating the hack of his university's network back in the 1980s, and that was actually traced to some kids in West Germany that were recruited by the KGB to break into I should say the Stasi, working with the KGB to break into American national security networks and try to steal information. One of the most fascinating keynotes I've ever seen in my life. But this problem has been with us for a long time. You have three main agencies in Russia that are responsible for intelligence, and cyber is a part of modern day intelligence collection. You have the SVR, Cozy Bear, or APT-29, as they're often called. They're the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, what used to be the first department of the KGB that had responsibility for foreign intelligence collection under the Soviet Union. You have the FSB, which has sort of a mix between FBI and CIA. It has an internal domestic security mission and suppression of dissent that they're being very successful in these days in Russia. But it also has an intelligence collection mission as well, particularly in the near abroad, what the Russians view as near abroad, so Baltic states and Ukraine and uh, Central Asia and the like. And then you have the GRU, which is actually the oldest intelligence service in Russia, goes back to the founding of the communist state by the Bolsheviks and was established in 1918, predates actually the KGB. And it is a military intelligence service, so it's part of the Russian armed forces and traditionally has had obviously deep connection to military strategic objectives, but also has had broader missions as well. They were involved in the election interference in 2016. Cozy Bear, the CSVR, was also in some of those networks that were compromised back in those times, but they were there purely for political espionage, downloading policy papers and the like. But the GRU was the one that was actually doing the hack and leak operation. So those are the main threat actors. GRU is often known as Fancy Bear or APT-28. But it's important to understand there are also different subunits within those agencies that have specific responsibilities. So the unit, for example, within the GRU that leaked the document was actually not the same as the unit that hacked it. So they have different missions. Info ops is different from the actual hands-on keyboard hacking activities. But those are the primary threat actors, and they work, of course, for the Russian intelligence services, and they do so based on the orders that are coming from the Russian leadership, and are there to fulfill the mandates for both espionage as well as what in Russia they call active measures, ability to influence other countries, ability to impact their mindset, their populations, and they've been very aggressive in this field, particularly in the last 15 years, and particularly since 2014, and really the breakdown of the relationship between the West and Russia, when Russia, of course, invaded Crimea, annexed it, and helped invade eastern Ukraine.
Got it. Thank you for that. So, from all those angry bears, like from your perspective, when we look at all those threat actors, they we discovered them obviously after the fact, not before they happen. Do they usually operate in a stealth for extended period of time, or as you mentioned, they use smaller grade? I would say lower grade cyber kiddies, or you have organized crime before they actually go for some target that they want to go after. So they're not necessarily, when they create this exploit, do they actually give this exploit away to test it out somewhere, or they hold it dear and near to their sort of heart before they go out and say, okay, I need to go after certain organizations or certain political group in the United States or any other country. So they try it out somehow that other give some pieces to cyber criminals. They will try it out and then they learn from that and then they move on and on their predetermined goals or targets. How do you see they
No,
evolve?
it is more organized. It's much less organized than it is in, let's say, the United States, where you have basically the intelligence community and the cyber command exclusively doing cyber ops, and people can't just willy nilly try things without lots of legal approval inside the government. And obviously, if you're just a freelancer on the outside trying to do something, you'll get arrested for violation of the CFAA, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, this law that goes back to the 1980s. That's not the case in Russia, but it is also not the case that this is a complete free for all and anything goes. So again, the operations of the intelligence services, the SVR, the GRU, and the FSB are done, based on the mission sets that they're given, based on the priorities for collection, for influence operations that come on on top, from on high, and the are typically executed by actual personnel that are sitting in uniforms inside GRU, or civilians inside SVR and FSB, although they kind of have military ranks in their intelligence community, even in the civilian side as well. And they do, though, have this symbiotic relationship with the criminal sector that has burgeoned over the last 20 years. And it works in several ways. One, it is a recruiting pipeline for them. So oftentimes when cyber criminals operate in Russia and they get caught by the law enforcement, if they're really good, they can be given a choice and they can kind of plead uh, uh, for clemency in exchange for coming to work officially inside the intelligence services. And what that means is that you will actually don the uniform of the service. You'll be a government employee, and you'll be doing your job just like anyone else would be alongside you. Now, a lot of these people, when they do that, they still keep their psychic going, and they're basically told that as long as you don't do this at home, that as long as you target people in your criminal activities that are considered our enemies in the West, that's going to be, we're going to look the other way at that. And sometimes there is loss of control where you've had some cases where the same tool set that was used by that individual in their day job for the state would be taken home and adapted maybe in some ways and then used for personal gain in in a sort of psychic capacity to make some money. This was most prominently seen in the hack by the FSB of Yahoo and Yahoo emails
Mhm.
back in 2014, 2015 timeframe, where this was a straight espionage operation. They were looking to compromise email accounts of former government officials and others of interest to the Russian state. Just a pure espionage operation that you'd expect to see from most nation states. But once they got into the Yahoo networks, and these were FSB personnel wearing the uniforms, but formerly with a criminal background, they decided to also make some money on the side and started looking for credit cards inside those emails and seeing what they could pick up, not for the state, not for the benefit of the state, but for the personal benefit, right? Obviously something that would be unacceptable in the United States or many other professional intelligence services. So you have that sort of freelancing and a pipeline of criminals coming into the intelligence services. And then you also have now sort of a burgeoning contractor ecosystem where uh, people volunteer their services for the intelligence community, in part to get something that in Russia is called krysha, or roof, essentially protection,
Mhm.
because they know that if you're just a criminal, or frankly any business person operating in Russia, whether it's illicit business or legitimate business, you need protection. You need protection from other criminals that could muscle in on you and try to take your profits. And you need protection from corrupt law enforcement that may want to cut as well. And one of the ways that you can get as a cyber criminal that krysha or that roof is by volunteering your services and providing information and so forth, and potentially getting taskings in order to keep the intelligence services on your good side, and making sure that if you ever run into any problems with law enforcement or mafia or the like, that you could potentially call in a favor and ask for help.
Uh, you actually brought the word that actually brought a lot of memories back. When you mentioned Krishna,
Imagine.
it's like, oh boy, I remember those days being there. Okay, so yeah, it definitely all this Krishna helps a lot of cyber criminals operate out of Russia without being prosecuted. And kind of, if you look at June 2017, so we had in May, WannaCry was released, made a lot of companies suffer, and then in June, NotPetya was released and into the wild, and it cost worldwide companies more than $10 billion to remediate consequences of the attack. So, was there any precursor for this malicious and destructive malware to come out, and would the organization been able to see spot based on all those events that were happening between Ukraine and Russia? Obviously, NotPetya was not really targeting anything outside of Ukraine, but a lot of organizations that were operating and having ties in Ukraine or having businesses or affiliates, they ended up being hit and cost them dearly because they were not really prepared. So if somebody will develop a threat intelligence and all those geopolitical events, like when looking at the past, we can learn what potentially can happen in the future. So how would you describe those events that occurred in June of 2017 with NotPetya and geopolitical situation at the time?
Yeah, so the story actually gets more complicated because it actually begins earlier with the shadow brokers leak out of the NSA, where we still don't know how and who, but a number of highly sophisticated exploit tools and malware that was developed by the NSA for their internal operations was supposedly left behind by this group of these shadow brokers. And as part of that release, there was a 0-day exploit called Eternal Blue of Windows that was discovered. It was right after um, uh, that was leaked out. Microsoft patched that exploit, but there were still lots of organizations that had not applied the patch. And WannaCry was one of the first, not the very first, but one of the first to leverage that exploit. And it was a really powerful exploit because it allowed you to spread laterally inside the network and execute code on other machines. So it was perfect for rapid propagation, sort of worm-like propagation within networks, which is what WannaCry did. Now, WannaCry was not Russia; it was North Korean operation, and it leveraged that exploit. And then uh, a month later, you had the NotPetya attack that also leveraged it. And NotPetya was also a supply chain attack where the Russians, and this was the GRU, has been attributed to the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, by the US government, compromised tax filing software that was used in Ukraine called MeDocs. So Ukraine is a fairly um, digitized society, as we're seeing since the war began, and uh, most companies in Ukraine that file taxes, or at least those that are interested in filing taxes, there is quite a bit of, unfortunately, corruption going on in Ukraine, but those that file taxes would use software to file it digitally, like MeDocs, and the Russians compromised MeDocs and released malicious update through that software channel that included their malware that would then spread using the Eternal Blue exploit and some other tools as well, and basically try to infect as many systems as possible. And as a result, you had that malware actually escape outside of Ukraine. It compromised a lot of networks inside Ukraine. It had a destructive component where it would essentially function as a wiper and wipe them out, but would also ultimately spread to Russian companies inadvertently because of the network interconnects between Ukrainian companies and Russian companies, and spread to the West as well because you had Western operations and subsidiaries of companies operating in Ukraine that got hit and then spread to corporate networks. So major companies like Merck and FedEx were severely impacted by that attack. But you're absolutely right that it had a geopolitical context because this was 2017. There's been, of course, an active war going on between Russia and Ukraine since 2014. And a number of cyber operations that the GRU had conducted against Ukraine, famously taking out their power for a few hours in 2015, and then repeating that in 2016, and then time with the Ukrainian uh, 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 holiday. They orchestrated this NotPetya attack. So there's been a lot of activity that the Russians have conducted that was done for political coercion purposes, for symbolism as well, and that was certainly one of them.
Uh, Dmitry, you froze or you lost your sound,
Really?
or you stopped talking.
He stopped talking.
Yeah.
He's fine. He's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, Steve, you will cut this off. So, no, Dmitry, that's great. And definitely NotPetya and Eternal Blue was, it still is actually. I've seen a lot of companies still having the same vulnerability for, the past 7+ years, and they haven't remediated it. So going forward in 2020, Russian group successfully attacked SolarWinds, and that also resulted in a lot of data exposure, and I think also government entities were involved in it, that they were able. And now, if you've seen, well, I'm pretty sure you follow the news. Last Friday, Microsoft disclosed that email accounts of some of its top executives were accessed by supposedly Russians again. So, are there any connection between what they did back in SolarWinds in 2020 and now they're coming back for this top organization? That kind of like when you described, in essence, when you look at MeDocs and you look, which is covers entire Ukraine, that they were doing digital taxes. So it's a great exposure, great effect when you attack organization that has so much people connected to it. Is it the same situation when we look at SolarWinds? Tons of organizations were utilizing SolarWinds, and now we have Microsoft top executives were essentially accounts compromised or they've been accessed, and what potentially we can get out of it besides, like, okay, yes, fine, Russians got into it, but I'm pretty sure there is underlying goal that they're trying to reach. It's not just simple event to see and do the stock trading, and well, Microsoft is doing fairly well. So next news probably not going to make huge swing on stocks if somebody is interested, but that's kind of when state sponsor actors going after those big corporations. There's got to be some underlying goal that they try and achieve, and we only see what we see on the surface.
Yeah, so in both cases, with the case of the SolarWinds hack and this recent what Microsoft calls midnight blizzard activity, it's been attributed in both cases to SVR, so again, a Russian foreign intelligence service, and the attacks are actually quite different. Obviously, in the case of SolarWinds, they broke into SolarWinds. They backdoored an update to SolarWinds that was distributed to customers and ultimately enabled them to get into those networks. Here, superficially, you have something similar, but technically, obviously, something that's very different, where they're able to actually use password spraying attacks to break into Microsoft and some other companies as well, and really look through emails that they can get access to for credentials that could be used to break into other companies as sort of follow-on attacks. So in principle, it's sort of the same activity, that the target you're going after may not necessarily be the primary target, but simply an access point into future networks that you really, really want. But it's done obviously very differently, one through the supply chain compromise of a piece of software through a backdoor, and in this case, just looking and collecting and harvesting credentials from emails that you may be able to access through password spray operation. And the goal of SVR, though, is espionage. So both in SolarWinds and likely here, they're collecting data. They're using it to inform their reports that go up to the leadership of the SVR and likely the Kremlin, if it's important enough. And they're not necessarily in the business of disruption like we see from the GRU. They don't have that typically active measures mandate that you would see from the military side.
Thank you for joining us for part 1, Cyber Threats and Geopolitics, with our guest, Dmitry Alpartovich. Stay tuned for part 2.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.